Every place on our planet has a story to tell of life, landscape, man, and the connections between them that stretch across space and time. This is the world as you've never seen it before. The Mediterranean, a sea almost completely enclosed by land. Bounded by three of the world's great continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. Formed when two of the Earth's tectonic plates collided, leaving an unstable mosaic of fault lines and volcanoes. But with a climate that nurtured life. The Mediterranean gave rise to agriculture, great ancient empires, and three of the world's major religions. This is the story of how raw nature joined forces with human invention and gave birth to Western civilization. But it's a story that might have ended before it began. Because 5.3 million years ago, there was no Mediterranean. What today is sea was then a vast, dry basin, peppered with strange salt crystal pools. The only thing keeping out the Atlantic Ocean was a plug of rock at the western end, a natural dam. But the full weight of the ocean was bearing down on that dam, on what is today the Strait of Gibraltar. Something had to give, and 5.3 million years ago, something did. It was the biggest waterfall in the history of the Earth. But the broken dam was narrow, and the basin vast. It took some 4,000 years for the Mediterranean to fill. And as it did, life came along for the ride. Dolphins, sea turtles, rays, and even scarier-looking characters. One fish would prove particularly vital to the people of the Mediterranean. Bluefin tuna, 700 pounds of solid protein. For millennia, fishing communities across the Mediterranean have depended on bluefin for their livelihoods. In Sardinia, they have a unique way of catching tuna, a kind of ambush called the matanza. Every May and June, huge schools of bluefin travel across the globe to return to the place where they were born, just west of this Italian island. The warm, shallow waters here are ideal for spawning. Over the centuries, the fishermen have learned exactly where the fish will be. They lay their trap, a corridor of nets 2 miles long, that funnels into La Camera della Morte, the chamber of death. The head fisherman watches and waits. When the net's full, he gives the signal for the trap to be sprung.
Tira, 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 tira di prua, tira giù, tira,
Bluefin's huge thrashing bodies can easily break a man's legs and arms. It's worth the risk. Bluefin has sold for up to $400 a pound at the sushi markets of Tokyo. Because sheltering waters like these lure in many tasty species of fish, coastal fishing has been a part of Mediterranean life for a very long time. And this is a sea with a lot of coast, because it contains a lot of islands. To see why means going back in time, long before the waterfall filled this sea, before the Mediterranean basin was even formed. 250 million years ago, all the land on Earth was gathered in a single supercontinent we call Pangaea. Over time, forces from deep within the planet's molten core tore Pangaea apart. New continents drifted across the globe on giant tectonic plates. The African and Eurasian plates converged, and the collision threw up mountains on what would be the Mediterranean seafloor. After the sea filled up, only the peaks of the mountains remained above water, otherwise known as islands. There are hundreds between what are today Greece and Turkey. The Aegean Islands. The people who settled here used rowboats to travel from island to island. But they weren't up to longer voyages or transporting cargo for trade. These problems were only solved with the invention of the sail. This is a reconstruction of one of the world's first sailing ships. The kind built by ancient Minoans on the island of Crete some 4,000 years ago. Its large square sail was braided with ropes so that sailors could control the amount of drive power by hauling it up or unfurling it. By 1700 BC, the Minoans were trading with Egypt, 400 miles to the southeast. The prevailing northwesterly winds blew them there with ease. But getting back, with the wind now blowing in their faces, was a problem. To get home, they had to rely on offshore breezes, and usually found themselves rowing again. Then, 2,500 years ago, Mediterranean sailors had an idea. They tied one end of the sail to the bow and pulled the other side up to make a triangle. They found they could manipulate a triangular sail to catch the wind, no matter which way it was blowing. The wind no longer had to be behind them. By positioning their bow at tight angles to the wind, they could zigzag in the direction the wind was coming from, a technique sailors call tacking. Suddenly, you could go where you wanted, when you wanted. This new ability to crisscross the Mediterranean led to an explosion in trade, not just in goods, but in ideas and technology. Mediterraneans absorbed whatever they found useful from the other peoples of the region. And soon, they would go further. In the 15th century, the Portuguese combined the maneuverability of the triangular sail with the driving power of the square sail in a single ship, called a carrack. This ship made possible the age of exploration. In 1492, Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue in a carrack. A voyage which would have profound consequences for the Mediterranean and for the whole world. For thousands of years, Mediterraneans had sailed the Mediterranean Sea. But in the 15th century, they began to explore the world beyond its borders. Ocean-going vessels now put the region at the center of a new global economy. But trading wasn't limited to a simple exchange of goods. Having learned to adopt and reinvent the best of what their own region had to offer, Mediterraneans now plundered the world. Even things that we think of as quintessentially Mediterranean turn out to be imports. Take the tomato, brought back by Spanish ships from America. Imagine the Mediterranean without it. No Italian pizza, no French ratatouille, no Greek salad. Eggplant came from India. Green beans were found in the Caribbean by Columbus himself. Even dried pasta was an import, brought to Sicily by Arabs in the 8th century. The Mediterranean peoples took these foods and made them their own, and this has brought remarkable benefits. In Crete, the Orthodox monks of the Gouverneto monastery eat in silence while prayers are read. For centuries, the monks have considered their simple Mediterranean diet to be good for both body and soul. They have just 2 meals a day: vegetables, cereals, olive oil, a little alcohol, some dairy products, and no meat. Now, a scientific study has revealed that members of this order have one of the lowest rates of heart disease in the world. And other research suggests a Mediterranean diet protects against depression, diabetes, asthma, even Alzheimer's. But despite their genius at adopting the fruits of other cultures, the commodity that Mediterraneans prized above all was a local one. It came from the fruit of a tree that originally grew only here, the olive. In the ancient Mediterranean, the thick oil pressed from olives was called liquid gold. It was used in religious rituals, in magic, as a lighting fuel, a medicine, a cosmetic. Olive oil was the crude oil of its day. Except, of course, you could eat it. But before the Mediterraneans could produce enough to supply their needs, the wild olive tree had to be tamed and cultivated. The first people to do this were the Minoans on Crete, 3,000 years ago. Botanists believe this particular tree is that old, and it's still bearing fruit. All over the Mediterranean, there are ancient olive trees. The ones in the Garden of Gethsemane, outside Jerusalem, were growing in the time of Jesus. The olive tree has a remarkable survival strategy. Its trunk is made up of several different stems, so that if one is damaged by a lack of water or nutrients, the others can compensate and keep the tree alive. But most of the time, the olive tree thrives in the mild Mediterranean climate. Hot, dry summers, thanks to high-pressure systems moving north from the Sahara. Cool, wet winters, as the prevailing winds bring moist air in from the Atlantic. It's also the ideal climate for that other definitive Mediterranean fruit, grapes. This vineyard in Sicily produces some of the finest wines on the island. But these grapes wouldn't be so fine if it weren't for a sinister neighbor looming on the horizon. Mount Etna. Etna is one of the most active volcanoes in the world. Its vast crater is 2,000 feet deep, constantly obscured by enormous plumes of poisonous gas. But Etna also gives Sicilian farmers a precious gift. Its volcanic ash enriches the soil, which makes the grapevines thrive. Mediterraneans have learned to accept the restless forces of nature as their constant companions, sometimes friends, sometimes foes. To this day, Etna is a brooding reminder of the geology that created the Mediterranean. Italy lies at the boundary between the African and Eurasian tectonic plates, the crumple zone for a clash of continents. The African plate is slowly being forced beneath the Eurasian plate. Deep underground, intense heat melts rock. Over the last 7.5 million years, lava has escaped through fissures in the Earth's crust, creating a chain of volcanoes, including the most notorious volcano in history, Vesuvius. Naples, on Italy's western coast, came to terms long ago with life in the volcano's deadly shadow. In 79 AD, the nearby resort town of Pompeii was quietly pandering to the Roman upper crust. When Mediterranean geology showed Mediterranean culture who was really in charge. Vesuvius exhaled a deadly cloud of ash and gas, called a pyroclastic flow. Superheated to 750 degrees Fahrenheit, this cloud flew down the sides of a volcano at 60 miles an hour. "10,000 died in suffocating agony. But the Romans found a way to profit from elemental natural forces. In fact, it was something they discovered as a direct result of Vesuvius's eruption, that allowed them to build the greatest empire the world had ever seen. The eruption of Vesuvius in the 1st century AD destroyed the town of Pompeii. But the volcanic ash that buried the town would build an empire. It was called pozzolanic ash. Excavators at this Italian quarry are still extracting it from volcanic lava 2,000 years later. The Romans discovered that if you mixed pozzolanic ash with lime, pumice, and water, it made a cement stronger than anything previously known. For Roman engineers, it was a gift from the gods, a rock that you could mold. With this cement, the Romans constructed buildings bigger and bolder than any that had come before. They built aqueducts with such precision that water could be transported over hundreds of miles down a gradual slope. One of their finest inventions in cement was the dome, a roof that was entirely self-supporting. Built in 126 AD, the Pantheon in Rome has a dome 140 feet in diameter. It remains the largest unreinforced dome ever created. Where other ancient civilizations had one magnificent city at their heart, the Romans were now able to build dozens of them, all around the Mediterranean Sea, which they called Mare Nostrum, our sea. The Romans created the only empire that has ever succeeded in uniting the entire region. In modern Libya, one of Rome's flagship imperial cities is spectacularly well preserved. Leptis Magna. Agriculture itself developed relatively late in human history, just 10,000 years ago. And it happened right here in the eastern Mediterranean, a region that stretches from present-day Israel through Iran to Iraq, an area known as the Fertile Crescent. Well over half of all the edible wild grasses in the world grew here. Rye, barley, oats, and one that was found here and nowhere else on Earth, wheat. Wheat was so valued that early hunter-gatherers abandoned their nomadic lives to settle down and cultivate it. They could store up grain to last them through the lean winter months. Rather than having to chase after food, these early farmers could stay in one place, creating the first permanent settlements. Stable communities meant more complex cultures. And from the beginning, Mediterranean culture was forged by the power of nature, to destroy and to create. So when religions sprang up here, they naturally embraced this paradox. By around 5500 BC, The practice of cultivating crops had spread from the Fertile Crescent to the rest of the Mediterranean. Settled agricultural communities led in turn to another major breakthrough: the domestication of animals. It turns out that very few animals are suited to the part, but the Eastern Mediterranean boasted 4 that were: sheep, goats, pigs, and the wild ancestor of all modern cattle, the auroch. All these animals fattened quickly, all accepted captivity, all took orders well from human masters. Well, almost all. Male aurochs, bulls, could pull your plow from dawn till dusk, but they could also turn on you in a flash. Ancient Mediterraneans both feared and revered the bull. In fact, they worshipped the animal as a god, worshipped it and the savage power of nature it represented. The cult of the bull is still alive and well in the Mediterranean. Spanish bullfight. Even life in the city we call the birthplace of Western civilization, Athens. Here on the Acropolis, the city's hilltop downtown, the Athenians built magnificent temples to their gods and sacrificed bulls to their patron saint, the goddess Athena. The Parthenon was a temple dedicated to Athena, the divine embodiment of reason. Athenian philosophers like Plato and Aristotle tried to understand their world through the use of logic and experiment. But Athenians were still Mediterraneans. They knew that not everything could be controlled through reason. And they weren't above seeking help from supernatural sources. Like the oracle at Delphi. The oracle was the priestess and earthly voice of Apollo, the Greek god of prophecy. Her revelations came to her during a trance. But modern science may have recently found an explanation for her magical powers. Deep beneath Apollo's temple, geologists have found beds of coal and bitumen. Organic deposits like these give off toxic gases such as ethylene and methane. Intermittent seismic shocks rock these caves, and the gases leak to the surface. Breathing fumes like these, anyone might think they were hearing voices. The Delphic oracle may have owed her prophetic powers to underground tremors. But there's no question the Mediterranean's history has been shaped by its violent geology. The Eastern Mediterranean experiences almost constant seismic activity. On average, it's hit by an earthquake every 4 days. The ancient Greeks believed earthquakes were caused by an unruly and powerful sea god. The Earth Shaker, they called him, Poseidon. For ancient Mediterranean peoples, earthquakes and all natural calamities were seen as omens, messages from the gods. But paganism and its many gods would soon give way to a very powerful idea. So powerful that it would transform the Mediterranean, body and soul. essential character of the Mediterranean has been molded by the region's unpredictable natural forces. But some of the most powerful movements the Mediterranean ever produced weren't seismic. They were spiritual. In the 1st century AD, the Mediterranean was home to many religions. Pagan cults, worshipping many gods, coexisted with Judaism, which worshipped one. The God of Abraham was eventually adopted as the God of Christianity, and that sounded the death knell for paganism. When the Roman Empire claimed Christianity as its state religion in 380 AD, it was simply acknowledging that the new faith had already dominated the Mediterranean. But 300 years later, to the south, a new force arose that would divide the region forever. One that called the divine by a different name, Allah. Islam began as both a religious and a military movement, a successful one. Muslims controlled 3/4 of the Mediterranean for 800 years. Starting in 614 AD, they spread out from Arabia, conquering lands and converting populations. Once again, the Mediterranean's geography shaped its history. There are no big mountain ranges running north to south in North Africa, which might have blocked the path of the Arab invaders. And so their conquest of the entire region was swift. Now that they controlled the Mediterranean's African coast, the Muslims had a staging post for further expansion. Christians and Muslims may have seemed worlds apart, but at the Strait of Gibraltar, they were separated by just 9 miles. And in 711 AD, that simple fact allowed Arabs, or Moors as they were called, to cross with ease and take Europe by storm. The progress of Islam wouldn't have been so rapid without a crucial military advantage. Their cavalry rode battle horses, whose resilience had been forged in harsh desert conditions. They were agile, brave, and quick to respond to commands, even in the heat of war. We still call these horses Arabians. On steeds like these, Islamic warriors swept through Spain in the early 8th century, seizing most of the Iberian Peninsula. They called it the Caliphate of Cordoba. The city of Cordoba was the capital of this Moorish powerhouse. Originally founded by the Romans, it now grew into the largest city in Western Europe. It was an urbane center of culture and learning, boasting many Islamic innovations like street lamps and trash cans. There were 50 hospitals, 300 public baths, and one of the grandest mosques ever built, the Mesquita. But in the Mediterranean, things can change dramatically in a very short time. In 1236, Cordoba was recaptured by Spanish Christians. And right in the middle of the mosque, the Catholic King and Queen of Spain built a cathedral. Its cruciform shape punched through the vaulted mosque's roof, a monument to the sometimes violent clash of cultures in the Mediterranean. When Islam departed Western Europe in the 15th century, it left behind a legacy, one that would have a deep and lasting impact on the Mediterranean and the entire world. It wasn't just cities like Cordoba or palaces such as the Alhambra. Muslims introduced many objects which we now think of as Western. In 1100, they brought the first paper from China, replacing the parchment made from animal skins used in Europe at the time. But the Arabs gave Europe more than things. They also brought learning and culture unknown to the West. Their own highly developed mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. It was Muslims, not Europeans, who had preserved and translated the classical texts of ancient Greece and Rome. They'd kept the wisdom of the ancients safe and added to it. All this was key to a scientific and cultural revolution. A 16th century art historian gave it a name: the rebirth, the Renaissance. The Renaissance took off in wealthy Italian cities such as Florence. True to its talent of borrowing the best from other cultures, the Mediterranean now began to rediscover its own past and reinvent it for a modern world. The Renaissance produced some of the greatest names in Western art and science. Michelangelo's sculpture reinvented the classical art of ancient Greece. Man and his world, portrayed with stunning naturalism. Leonardo da Vinci was the original Renaissance man, so much more than the sum of his parts. Sculptor, scientist, and engineer. He also produced some of the greatest paintings of all time. The great Renaissance cities competed for preeminence in commerce and culture. None defines this era of the Mediterranean more perfectly than this one. Venice, a city that built an empire on maritime trade. While other port cities were built by the sea, Venice floats above it. The city stretches across 118 islands in a marshy lagoon. Venetian engineers constructed 400 bridges and cut 200 canals. They had to sink wooden piles down through thick silt until they hit firm ground. A triumph of human civilization over raw nature. And yet Venice is also a reminder of how transient such victories can be. Man might win the battle, but nature will always win the war. Venetians know the sea will one day reclaim their city. The deep, compacted clay the city rests on is sinking. But even this isn't the entire story. For in the Mediterranean's end is a glimpse of its beginning. The collision between Africa and Eurasia that created this remarkable region goes on, and millions of years from now, the sea will vanish as the Earth's crust folds and cracks. The shattered remnants of Venice will rise far above the waves as the Mediterranean is transformed into a mountain range the size of the Himalayas. Geologists have already named them the Mediterranean Mountains. From Spain in the west to Turkey in the east, snow-capped peaks will stretch as far as the eye can see, waiting for a new generation to try their hand at taming the untamable.